Good morning, students. Welcome to Tathastu's Aadharshila. We will be discussing environmental conventions of international and national importance in the set of these videos launched by Aadharshila. And today, welcome to the first video, which is about Ramsar Convention, as you have already seen. So, we will be discussing the conventions mostly in chronological order. Sometimes we will be getting in some conventions which are more in line with the previous discussions, which may be out of chronology, but in general the pattern that we will be following will be in terms of the chronology. Alright, so let's talk about Ramsar Convention. Now firstly, why environmental convention? So basically, environment was not much of a concern for mankind as such during the time of the world wars. But after the world wars, when we started settling down, then we started to realize the importance of environment. Slowly there started happening discussions. We realized that all our natural resources are being lost. We were not able to maintain that level of environmental sustainability, and then we realized the importance of conserving resources. And in this line of discussions, the first environmental convention that the world discussed was Ramsar. Now, Ramsar is actually a place in Iran. It's a town in Iran. And the main topic for discussion in the Ramsar was wetlands. And that is why the convention for wetlands is known as Ramsar. Good morning, students. Good morning, all of you. So let's talk about what Ramsar Convention was. Let's just give ourselves a brief history of the Ramsar Convention. So initially, as I said, there was nothing concerned about the environment, and then came in 1960, wherein there was a call, there was a cry for conservation of habitats for waterfowls. Waterfowls, also known as water birds. So we wanted something which could conserve the habitat of waterfowls and water birds, and thereby started this conference called the Mar Conference. If we talk about it, in 1960 there was a Mar Conference. In this Mar Conference, there was a cry for conservation of habitats for water birds and waterfowls. And therefore started the discussion, and from 1963 till 1971 we were discussing, we were trying to find out more, we were trying to debate out, we were trying to create a handbook, a rule book, and this kind of process was known as text negotiation. Then 18 countries met in Ramsar, and this was the Ramsar Convention, which was convened in 1971. Alright. Then in 1974, the first Ramsar site was declared. This Ramsar site was Coburg Peninsula, which was in Australia. Alright, so this was what was happening. And then coming to our very old story of India, which became a part of Ramsar in the year 1981. So this is what the whole story of Ramsar is. So let us first talk about what happened in this phase. We tried to devise a definition, a kind of definition for wetland. Now this definition will help us to identify and to give ourselves a holistic picture of what are wetlands. Starting with, firstly, the definition has three parts. We first talk about what kind of areas are they, alright? Yes, Chilika. Chilika came in 1981. You are very right, Venkat. Then we talk about the kind of, and then we talk about the salinity of water, and then we talk about exclusion criteria. So what are wetlands? Wetlands are areas of marsh, fen, peatland or water. Marsh, fen, peatlands or water. Now one thing we should know, wetlands are wet but they are land. So what are they? They are a transitional zone between the terrestrial ecosystem and the marine ecosystem. They are not completely aquatic, but they are not completely terrestrial. They are somewhere in between. They are wet and marshy swamps. So these are the places where you will find this kind of atmosphere, where there is marsh. Marsh is wet land where the mud is really dense with water. There is a lot of water. Sticky clay is the consistency of the soil. Or it could be a pen. Pen is basically a salt pan or somewhere where there is water which is evaporating at a rate. Alright. Or they could be peatlands, or they could simply be water submerged land. Alright. They could simply be land which is submerged under shallow water. Then, what kind of water? Water could either be static or it could be fluid. Alright. What is the salinity? Salinity could be fresh, it could be brackish, or it could also be salty. What is fresh? Which has little or no salt content. No salt content basically. It could be brackish, which is like not very salty, but yes, there is some amount of salt, somewhere around more than 5 parts per million. Or it could be simply salty. Salty is something like Dead Sea, which is very high content of salt. Moving on, this water could also be permanent or it could be temporary. So we are trying to find the definition of Ramsar wetlands, and we talked about the areas which could be in wetlands. We talked about the water that could be in wetlands. Now the exclusionary criteria is the low tide. The low tide should not be exceeding more than. So we can have a wetland which is submerged in water, we can have a terrestrial body which is submerged in water, but it should not be lower, the thickness of water should not be more than 6 meters in its lowest tide, not in high tide, in its lowest tide, it should not be more than 6 meters. And this, dear students, is the definition of wetlands under Ramsar Convention. Moving on, we talked about this phase where there was text negotiation and we tried to figure out a definition. Now, what happened in 1971? In 1971, we had 18 nations. Was India a party? India was not a party. India came way later in 1981. Who were there? There were many international organizations which were putting in efforts, which were putting in all kinds of resources to build this Ramsar Convention. And out of these organizations, the ones noteworthy of mentioning are firstly IUCN, then our very own BirdLife International, then we had World Wildlife Fund for Nature and Natural Resources. Then there was an NGO which was already working with wetlands. There was Wetlands International. Then there was IWMI, International Water Management Institute. This was already there. Apart from that, there was another trust known as Wetland and Wildfowl Trust. So these were the 6 bodies which were a part of the Ramsar Convention. They were negotiating and they were trying to build this Ramsar Convention from scratch. These 6 are important. UPSC may ask you all of this in prelims about these 6. They may ask you that which were the 6 initial inaugurating bodies which were a part of Wetlands International, and that is why it is important that we learn these. It is very important. Moving on. So now after this was negotiated in, we've already talked, in 1974 our first Ramsar came into play. First Ramsar site came into play, and that was Cobourg Peninsula in Australia. Please remember, Cobourg Peninsula in Australia. That was the first Ramsar site. Now what was Ramsar debating upon? Ramsar had the 3 pillars. Was firstly we talked about, because the first issue for discussion was only habitat conservation for water birds and waterfowls. This was the first part of the pillar. The second part of the pillar was wise use. Wise use of resources. We have to learn to use the resources wisely. We cannot waste whatever resources we have. And the third pillar, so these 2 were already there in all the organizations, but the third pillar was international cooperation. And these were the 3 pillars which were the building blocks of Ramsar. And the Ramsar started to have a COP, Conference of Parties, every 3 years, and it was convened by 18 elected members. Today we have close to 172 nations participating. 172 nations. Out of these 172 nations, we have 18 members who will be taking part in the Conference of Parties. Now, what is Conference of Parties? Conference of Parties is the highest decision-making body, wherein the top-notch officials from each country who is a member in that 18 members will come and participate in this Conference of Parties, and new kinds of rules or new kinds of discussions and delegations are going to happen. And this is what is happening in this entire scenario of Ramsar. These 18 elected members constitute of what is known as the Standing Committee. So this is the structure of Ramsar. Coming on, we have modified Ramsar twice. One is in 1980 and once we have modified it in 1987. In 1982, we came up with Paris Protocol, and in 1987 we came with Regina Amendment. So again, UPSC may ask you a question not about what is there in these amendments or what are the details, but simply we are often hearing two terms, Paris Protocol and Regina Amendments. What is the context? And the answer will be Ramsar Convention. So that is why it is important that you know these things. These are words which you should have in your mind. Moving on. What is another word that we come across is Montreux's record. Now what happened was, despite adding sites to Ramsar, sites were being added in Ramsar. Currently in India there are 75 Ramsar sites. Sites were being added, but there was not enough conservation efforts there. The diversity, the biodiversity, the flora and fauna, the ecology was seen to be deteriorating. And that is why Ramsar came up with something known as the Montreux's record. In the Montreux's record, it would give names of those wetlands which are a part of Ramsar but are in requirement of urgent intervention for ecological conservation, or there was a severe loss to biodiversity, a threat in those areas. India had Chilika in this and Keoladeo Ghana. Chilika exit this list recently, and it is again a current affairs question that Chilika is no more a part of the Montreux's record, but India had these two sites initially in the Montreux's record. And this is the scenario about Montreux's record. Moving on to World Wetlands Day. This Montreux's record came into play in 1990. And in 1997, we were able to define our World Wetland Day on 2nd February. And from then onwards, every February 2nd, we are celebrating World Wetland Day. Now, this is the brief history of Ramsar, the kind of definitions that we have. If we start revision, this is the timeline that we discussed. In this timeline, we talked about the Mar Conference, then we talked about the text negotiation. In the text negotiation, we figured out a definition. Then happened the 1971 Ramsar Convention. We had 6 international participating bodies. We have 18 member countries. Then by 1974, we were able to declare our first Ramsar site, which was important for conservation. And then in 1974 and in 1981, we had India joining the list. And soon in 1990, we declared Montreux's record. 1997, we were able to celebrate World Wetland Day. Now coming on to the India part. Now initially, UPSC was asking you questions on Ramsar sites because the number of Ramsar sites was fairly low. There was not a lot of Ramsar sites, and we were asking. But in the past 2-3 years, close to 40 plus, in fact 47 to 48 sites have been declared just in the last 3 years, which takes the number to 75. A total of 75 wetlands are present in India. And now UPSC is more interested about the specifics of the wetlands, of each wetland, of each of these wetlands, why they are a part or all that. Why the recently included wetlands is what is now grabbing UPSC's attention. But a brief idea of the location of these Ramsar sites is important for students. Yes, it is not possible to learn all this in one go. So what you can do is you can take a screenshot of this image from the Environment Ministry, the site, and the Wildlife Institute of India. Take a screenshot of this and try to look at it every day and sort out the locationally important wetlands. We have 75 plus, so it is very difficult for us to define each one by location and place. I can do it for you, but then it is not something which is retentive. The return on that may not be very high, and that is why just try to look at this map and try to locationally organize these wetlands. Some of importance could be Keuladev and Chilaka, of course. Keuladev is in Rajasthan. We need to figure out which is the largest wetland. Talk about the largest wetland in India, mostly Sundarbans, East Calcutta wetlands. And if we talk about the smallest, then it's Pong. Pong Dam Lake. But we can keep this as a reference map, and we can keep looking at it every now and then so that we are able to locationally sort the wetlands. Coming back to the wetland rules which were given in 2017. In 2017, India came up with its own wetland rules, and we had certain regulations put forward for wetlands, and some of them were, we excluded certain sites. Now, as we talked about the definition of Ramsar wetlands, we talked about artificial or natural. When we were talking about the definition, we spoke about if the wetland is either artificial or natural. But in Indian 2017 wetland management rules, we have excluded artificial sites. We have excluded canals. We have excluded paddy fields. We have excluded areas which are used for salt manufacturing. Areas which are reserved for aquaculture, irrigation. River channels which have been artificially created. All these sites have been excluded from wetland conservation. Apart from this, those which are included in Indian Forest Act 1927, Wildlife Protection Act 1972, State Forest Acts, Coastal Regulations Zone 2020. All these sites are not a part of India's conservation efforts under wetlands because they are already covered in some or the other legislation, in some or the other format, and that is why, just remember this could be a potential UPSC prelims question, that what of these are included under the wetland management rules, because India has done this and it was a major discussion, it was a major debate going on that why are we excluding these areas. But for us it is important to remember that these are not a part of the wetland rule. Alright, we have not included this, please learn it. Okay, and I am getting back to the first page where we've talked about the wetlands in India. If you do wish, we could make a discussion video for all these wetlands. Drop your suggestions in the comment section. We will be meeting again in the next video live. Thanks for watching. Keep studying for your prelims. Thank you.